Hi, if you work with Rails, you must have heard about Rack. Even if you haven't heard of it, you have definitely used it because Rails uses Rack behind the scenes. Rack is one of those confusing topics in Rails for many new developers as well as the advanced ones. When I started learning Rails, I didn't get it for a long time. But once I understood it, it changed the way I look at Rails applications and even web applications in general. So in this video, I will try my best to explain my understanding of what Rack is, how it works, and how you can use it to build web applications. So let's get started. So before we dive into the code, let's start with understanding the basic architecture behind Rack. We'll start with a simple HTTP request. So whenever you type a URL in your browser and hit send, it sends that HTTP request to a web server such as Nginx, which forwards that request to an application server such as Puma, which sends it to your Rails application. Then your application does its thing and sends the response back on the same pipeline to the browser. Now, where does Rack fits in here? So this is where Rack comes in. It enables communication between the application servers and the applications. And the problem it's trying to solve is that you can have different application servers such as Puma, Unicorn, Thin, Webrik, and many more. On the application side, you can have a Rails application, a Sinatra application, or a plain Ruby script. Now, for any of these application servers to talk to any of these applications, they need to know their interface. By interface, I mean just what method they will call on the application side and what parameters it will pass. And the same for all application servers, right? And on the other hand, for if you're building an application or application framework, you need to understand um, the API of the application server so you can talk to it, right? So the arrow is bidirectional. And as you can see, the picture quickly gets pretty complex as the applications or application servers increase. So that's the problem we had before Rack came along. Anytime you're building an application server, you needed to understand what applications it's going to interface with. Anytime you're building an application, you needed to understand the interfaces of the application servers it would talk to. So it was pretty complicated. So that's why Rack was developed. Rack is nothing but a simple protocol that provides an interface between application servers and the applications. Now, none of the application servers need to worry about what the interface of the applications are or application frameworks. As long as they talk to the Rack interface, that is, as long as they follow the Rack protocol, they can talk to any other application that follows the same protocol. We'll see what that interface is in the code pretty soon. But for now, just understand that as long as an application server follows the Rack protocol, it can talk to any other application that follows the Rack protocol. And it simplifies the communication interface between the application servers and the applications. So that's the main benefit of Rack as a protocol. Now let's try to understand the Rack interface by building a very simple and basic web application in Ruby without using any framework. So I have an empty directory open here in VS Code. Let's add a new file called config.ru. Don't worry about the RU extension for now. It just stands for rackup, but it's a plain Ruby script. Let's add a class named app. You can name it anything. Let's add a method called call that takes a hash called env, which stands for environment, and it returns an array. Now, what does that array represent? It should have a status code, a hash representing the HTTP headers, and an array containing string response. Okay, so let's build that array. So for a successful request, the status code is 200. We'll keep the header simple, just add a content type, which is set to text HTML, and our response contains just hello world. Let's make it HTML, so we'll add a h1 tag and close it here. Okay, so this is the standard rack interface. It says that as long as your application has a call method that takes a env hash and returns an array containing status code, headers, and the HTTP response array, um, it can talk to any web application server that follows the rack protocol. Looks like I forgot to close the headers hash. Okay. Oh. All right, that looks good. And now we want to run our application, so we'll just say run app.new. Don't worry about the run method for now. It's just a standard rack terminology. Now we want to run our application, so we need a web server such as Puma or Webbrick or Thin or Unicorn. We'll use Puma because that's the Rails recommended web server. So if you go to the Puma's web GitHub repository, you can install it using gem install Puma, and to run you just type Puma. And if you run Puma without any arguments, it just looks for a rackup file. As I told you, the .ru stands for rackup file in the working directory called config.ru. As long as our the directory has config.ru file, Puma will be able to run that application. So we have that config.ru and we'll run Puma. So the server has started and it's running on port 9292. So let's go to that address. And it says hello world. So the way it works is when you make this HTTP request using the browser, it first talks to Puma, which builds the hash representing the HTTP request and forwards that to our application in here. So we have access to that env hash here. And right now we are just returning an array containing the status code, the headers, and the response. And Puma sends that back to your browser and it renders that response. So that's how rack protocol works to allow communication between application servers and the applications written in Ruby. But that's not all. In addition to being a specification or protocol, rack also provides a nice domain-specific language and middleware tools to build web applications. So I wrote a blog post on rack which goes in those topics in detail. I'll post a link in the description. You can check it out. I'll just quickly summarize the additional things that rack provides for you. So first we have the rack specification, as we just discussed, with its call method and return array that contains the response. Then you have the rack gem, which provides a bunch of things. So you have the middleware toolbox. Now what's a middleware? Rack interface is so simple. You can build tools that provide services to your main application, and you can wrap your application in those tools, which all follow rack protocol. And think of them like functions. So you have your main function that does the main application logic, and you have like these peripheral concerns or functions that provide extra service for your application, such as logging, authentication, and many more things. So rack provides a bunch of these middleware tools, and you can think of this middleware as a pipeline. So whenever a request comes from Puma, it can go through these middleware tools. And for example, I have the authentication middleware here. So it does the authentication. If it fails, it immediately returns the response. If it passes, it forwards it to the next middleware in the pipeline until it reaches your application. Okay. And all these rack applications return the same response, same format, response in the same format containing status, headers, and body. And so that's how the middleware pipeline works. Actually, I might do a video on this in detail sometime in future. Here are a bunch of middlewares that Rack provides for you. It's not a complete list, but you can check the GitHub repository for more middlewares. So other than middleware, we also have tools to build Rack applications, such as request response classes that wrap that env hash and provide a nice API so you can access the HTTP request and response, mock request for testing, and other stuff. Then you also have the rackup command. Now, so far we have been using the Puma command to launch our application. But what that does, it ties our application to Puma web server. What if we need to use another web server? So rackup command abstracts that. So let's go to our application. I'll stop my application and I'll use rackup. Now it starts the application and it returns the same response. So nothing has changed except that we have abstracted the web server from our application. So you can replace the server behind the scenes. So you can replace Puma with Thin or Unicorn and it will work. Finally, it has the convenient DSL. So when I started, I told you to ignore the run method, right? So that's the DSL that Rack gives you. So you have the run method. You also have the map method that acts like a router. And you have the use method to include the middleware. So you can write your applications like this. So you have this builder class that Rack provides, and you can use method to add different middleware. You can add map for as a router, and finally you run your application. So that's the nice DSL we have that comes with Rack. All right. So I hope that was useful, and hopefully you have a much better understanding of what Rack is and how to use it to build web applications. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments and I will try my best to answer them. Take care. Bye now.